Hello and welcome to the podcast where we explore everything to do with game design, economy, and commercial delivery of games. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Javier Barnes. Javier, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, I've been in the mobile games industry for over 10 years. I currently work as product manager, but I've done a little bit of everything. Particularly in the context of this interview, I was game economy designer and game economy director at Gameloft, and I've touched a little bit of everything games related, including being a game designer, game developer. I've released games in console where I was the only developer. So I think I can provide a holistic view on a topic that it's very holistic to start with, which is game economy.
I love the way you said that. It's a very holistic topic. And I think that's absolutely the key here, which is, again, what I'm trying to get across in the way that we're writing the book is to understand kind of like there are a lot of moving pieces, and how we focus on how those moving pieces function in game systems is key, but they exist both kind of materially in the mechanics and the data, in the numbers, but also in the expectations and the emotions set in the players. So, I mean, that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. But how do you look at it? If you're sitting down with a game, and like I say, you've been through all the stages. You've done a lot of mobile, but you've done PC console stuff as well in the past. But if you're starting down thinking about a game, what's the point where you normally get involved? Are you getting involved right at the beginning, or are you being brought in halfway through, or are you being brought in to fix a game? What would be typical, the kind of way that you would get started looking at an economy in a game?
So when it comes to me, specifically, I've worked both in new games and in live games. I would say that for the most part, most of the games that I've worked were games that were already launched, which presents a different set of challenges when it comes to managing game economy and systems. I would say that the best moment to enter is as early as possible, because I think you hinted it as you were talking about how to balance a game economy. But the thing with a game economy or a set of game systems is that in order to be balanced, it has to have been designed to be balanceable. No,
Yes.
the worst situation, I believe, is when like the game economy and the systems and like how the rewards are going to behave are set up, and then you bring in a game economist or a game designer that is going to do the balance and has to create order out of systems that were not made with the idea of balance in mind. So I think one element here is that, to me, it's very important, is to keep in mind that the way the systems are designed are going to make balancing it easier or harder or even impossible. Specifically, for example, I'm thinking, I think one of the things probably hardest to balance, but in that it exemplifies this case in particular, is loot boxes or gacha systems, whatever. In many cases, we have seen this over and over where players don't feel it's nice. It's a nice system, and players often hate this type of systems. And many of them provide a very bad experience. They don't feel rewarding, etc. And I think that it creates a very interesting situation, because they feel, well, this doesn't feel nice. This is not fun. It's not really making me enjoy the game. And if I think on the monetization proposition, it's expensive. I really don't want to pay for this. I would maybe pay for other things, but not for this. And they assume that this is because the game economist or the game designers did well their job, as if they wanted to make the game less fun in order to monetize, while in reality, it's often the other way around, where them not being enjoyable and not really wanting players, generating that players want to spend their money and their energies on that product is often because there has been maybe mistakes on how they were designed, and that doesn't make it great. I think a great example for me of very well executed loot box system is the Magic the Gathering booster packs. Almost no one complains about that.
Nope.
Exactly. We don't even think about it as a gacha system, but they are a gacha system, right? It's just that they are so good, and the way they have been designed, whenever you open a booster pack, you feel that you got something that was really worth it, and it's a very fun experience. And that's why it doesn't hurt to spend money or to open booster packs, because you're never disappointed. It's a very fun experience.
And as someone who bought the third pack of Magic the Gathering ever on sale in the UK, and it's a long story, but I got a Mox Ruby, which nobody will remember what a Mox Ruby is. Everyone remembers a Black Lotus. The Mox Ruby was the red version of the Black Lotus back in the day, and it wasn't quite as powerful, but it was interesting. Like you say, the magical moment, the point of those Magic the Gathering booster packs, but loot crates, the whole point of them was to add a little spice, variety, and expectation of delight. But because I think people have tried to, there's a mechanism, I'll use that mechanism without working out why that mechanism worked. These tools of the design trade turned into tropes and became badly implemented, and therefore we're now told that they're dark patterns. I think particularly with loot boxes, the ability to essentially resell things has meant that some people now think of those in a more gambling sense, which I disagree with, but I understand why people have that feeling. But I think this really gets to a really important point, which is like understanding what it is, the power that we have in the way that we design these systems and the effect that they have on player behavior is fundamental. And if we don't start with the base principle there, we're not going to kind of really be able to have full control. And therefore, we're always going to be playing second guess to try and fix something which may or may not be right. So what is the economy in a game? For you, I'm looking at the whole gamut of rewards, difficulty balancing, all that kind of stuff, as well as commercial items. But what are you looking at when you're thinking about the game economy itself?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, it's back to the holistic thing, isn't it? Yeah.
For me, if I think about the topic, obviously, I think that the way players perceive the game is entirely holistic. No, players don't separate between like the game economy from the game systems, from the reward system. They perceive it as a single thing. And then I think we designers can apply like different lenses or filters to try to create views or create segments out of something that in reality is supposed to be a very cohesive experience. When it comes to the game economy in particular, it's difficult for me to pinpoint what is really outside of the economy. The way I tend to think it is I try to visualize games as loop systems. I think that almost every single kind of game has some sort of loop. In particularly when it comes to mobile, I think that maybe we could argue with single player games that don't repeat.
I had a whole wonderful conversation with Todd Kelly on this very subject of whether we are as designers falling into a trope by going down loops. But I'm a loop person too. I do like thinking of things in loops. Yeah.
So the way I think it is, I try to visualize games as a set of loops, and at the most abstract level, I think that the game economy would be the systems of resources that exist in that loop, no? And that is pretty much anything that could be counted. To me, is a resource. It could be experience, it could be items, it could be currencies. At the end of the day, those are systems that were like the game introduces some of these elements and removes elements on the other end, no? Like maybe, I don't know, I get currencies and I use the currency for something which transforms that into something else, etc., etc., etc. And that completes the loop. All that is part of the economy, and what I think the game economist job is, and again, the name of the position itself could be different. Like it could be a game designer that is managing the economy or a product manager, whatever. But it's controlling all these systems of essentially taps and sinks of resources.
Yeah, no, and like I say, there's so many. I think people call taps, sinks and sources, drains and faucets. We all basically talk about the same principle, where we're looking at how we gain an element, a factor. And that factor can be a currency, it can be a resource, it can be an object, it can be access to a mission, it could be a number of things, and then how we effectively spend that in the game. And so, when you look at those things, I mean, how do you understand how they work in the game? Particularly, I'm thinking about as a game player, we go through different life stages of play. Our understanding of the game will evolve over time. Our needs in the game will probably match some sort of progression element, I'm guessing. I mean, again, I don't want to speak too much the phrases for you, but how are you looking at taking control, or are you even looking at taking control of all those different elements in the game?
Well, the way I see it is, I mean, economy, at the end of the day, we look at the definition, is like the science that I'm recalling from memory that studies the production, distribution, and trade of resources. I don't think that the game designer or a game economist can control the economy. I think that
Yeah.
the economy is something that happens, same as fun. No, it would be fantastic if a game designer could control the fun, but in reality, the game designer does is it controls game elements, and that should create an effect that is generate fun and then administer that or manage that experience of fun. No, with the economy, I think it happens a bit the same. Where to me, the key concept here is motivation. What the player does is the player uses the game and extracts fun,
Hmm.
and the um, the way or as part of that process, it obtains progression, it executes a set of actions. The game, through its rules, through the different injections of rewards, etc., it incentivizes players to take some actions over others. If that's not fun, then the player will not be motivated, then the player will maybe stop, not be a participant of that economy. While if the economy does its job well, it will maintain that motivation. It may generate additional motivations and ultimately preserve fun, which is what the player at the end of the day wants to get from the game. So for me, the key thing here is thinking on the motivation, thinking on why the player is doing something. The best and the best situation is where the system of incentives makes the players do the actions that are going to make the game more fun
Yeah.
and more willing to the player to remain as part of that system. But there can be situations where and it actually happens quite often, where it's the other way around, where the most efficient way to play is not really the most fun, or where the most fun way to play is not really the one that as a developer I want the
Yeah.
players to engage. Right now I'm playing a lot of Magic the Gathering Arena, which is like the virtual version of the game,
Absolutely.
and what I enjoy the most is playing drafts. But
Yeah.
playing drafts is monetized. Like if I want to play more than certain amount of drafts, I need more resources that I would need to pay. And what I do is I have multiple accounts. So with the free resources of those many accounts, I have unlimited ability to play drafts. But this is not what the developers would want, right? But I
Yeah.
found a way to kind of hack the economy in order to get the most fun experience, because there's a mismatch between what the game economy tries to do, which is, okay, you want to enjoy this over and over again, then you need to like pay, and what I want as a player.
But I think what's interesting, what I think you said there is you're kind of almost looking at the currencies, the activities, the things that you transact as the sort of combination between the lubricant of those loops and the kind of the marker of progress against those loops in some ways. Yeah. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good definition. That's why I think that at the end of the day, what we can do as game economists is try to create systems of incentives to try to encourage the players to take some sets of actions. But it's very difficult or I'm not even sure if it's possible to like force the game to make players take actions that the player doesn't want.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why, when I look at this, I'm basically trying to work out in this game design, what are the things that players care about and what are the mechanisms I'm trying to get them to play and how are those mechanisms inherently interesting to play. And therefore, these are the utility items. Therefore, I'm looking at where the sinks and sources of those utility items are. From that is where I understand the economy. And that's where I'm starting to look at things like, the spend rates, the drop rates, and how that affects progression, how that affects performance in those particular experiences. I think none of that kind of work in every game because, well, it works in a lot of games, but the thing for me is things like power-ups are really natural things that work very well with this way of thinking. But if you've got a game that doesn't have a need for power-ups, for example, if it's purely about how skilled you are, does it really matter? If it's like solving does the power up work at all? And how do you come up with an economy system that drives ongoing play with a relatively straightforward puzzle system? Because, hints aren't making you better able to do it. They're just kind of like cheating your way out of it. I mean, I'm not entirely serious. Am I making sense? It's like working out what is the variable that creates that liquidity.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, as I said, it's a topic of, I think it's a topic of motivation. No, one thing that I feel it was very interesting on what you mentioned was, well, in this type of game, if you try to make this thing part of the economy, like if it's a very skill-based game, when you try to sell power or introduce power as an element of the economy, that may not work out, etc. I think at the end of the day, what it exemplifies is that there's no such thing as a perfect economy. It depends on the agent of that economy, on the player. No, what we want is to make the player be motivated and be encouraged to take the actions that are going to make the game more enjoyable. So the player decides to remain as part of the game, wants to monetize, and so on. It's an element on how the economy fosters and preserves engagement. For example, in some games, many games in mobile, maybe power is part of the equation, and we want to, because I don't know, a player on an RPG game enjoys progression. Part of what makes the game fun is to understand and find the best ways in order to obtain the elements that you need in order to become powerful. So those try to, when you play an RPG game, you enjoy progressing and you kind of play against the game, right? You're trying to break it down and find what sets of actions are going to increase your numbers so you can beat the challenge that the game presents to you. But maybe in other games like MOBA, players are not, they value skill much more. They're much more competitive in the sense of like dexterity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is much more important for players to be, for that to be preserved, and therefore the economy and the way the motivation is maintained is through generating something completely different, which may be cosmetics, for example, and
Yeah.
players play and they take actions in order to obtain progression, but not progression that gets translated into power, but rather progression that gets translated into cosmetics. And through those systems, that's a tool for the designers to encourage players to take the sets of actions that will increase and preserve engagement, be it play different game modes or play with diversify the characters that they play with, and so on.
Yeah, and I think
So
that
to
that
me,
whole principle. Yeah, sorry, go for it. Yeah.
ultimately, it's about the agent of the economy, no?
Yes.
Who the player is, what do they enjoy, and what as a developer we want to we want to encourage the players to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like you say, the agent of progression or agent of engagement, those things are absolutely kind of key to understanding where you're going to take that. And I think it's why we end up quite often in some games having different types of layers of those loops. The ability to play the game, but then that progresses in a different context. Those things, it shows the diversity of what's possible when we're looking at a game and looking at how we create experiences for players that are, at the end of the day, satisfying and fulfill a need state that makes me want to keep playing. And again, just comes back to, are these vectors, these elements that we build into our economy actually providing something manageable and interesting for the player?
Yeah, the way I understand it, as I said, no, is I think that to me the pillar of an economy is knowing as a designer what do we want the player to do, what activities do we want the player to engage, and then design the economy in order to make that experience that we want to generate, which we think it's the most engaging one, to make it the most rational to do. No, let's say we have a game that is going to have like different game modes, and we know that our players enjoy mastering the different game modes. Then
Mhm.
the economy, so we want players to play or diversify their time and play all the game modes.
Yeah.
Then the way we're going to design the economy will be in order to encourage players to diversify their activity, and for example by making that each game mode gives a resource that is needed, so players need to play multiple game modes or maybe all of the game modes. While if what we want is to the players to just play any game mode, then we are going to design the economy with more generic resources that you can obtain from different places in more or less the same ratio. So players can choose where do they spend their time. I think that
Mm.
where the most dangerous way to design the economy is first when there's no vision on what or no intention under it. We don't know if we want players to play game modes or not. So how you're going to design a game economy, like you don't
Yeah.
really know what you want to achieve with that economy, or when the economy is mindlessly replicated. At the beginning of the conversation, we talked about like gacha mechanics. Well, it's dangerous to try to replicate gacha mechanics without just because, oh well, this has been done in this game. They do it this way. We just replicate it, copy paste. But if you don't understand what you wanted, why it worked, and why did they did this specific way, you can copy mistakes or you can execute on a system that is
Mm.
really inadequate for the experience that you want to create in your game.
No, completely. And let's face it, this is why we've ended up with some of these systems getting really bad names, because most of those so-called exploitative methods have often been the result of poor implementations and lack of understanding of the motivation and the payoff, and that balance between cost, scarcity, desirability. I think that becomes I mean, particularly when you've got large teams, often AAA teams, trying to add some of these methods, and they've built a game on a different rationale, and now they're having to reformat into these systems without necessarily understanding what makes them tick. You can see why people make mistakes, like putting Yoda into a loot box when theoretically you should have expected to be able to get Yoda just through normal play.
Yeah, and specifically with that topic, sometimes what players and even developers think that makes something more fair or more desirable is not necessarily what or creates a better experience. Is not really what makes it the best. No, I think that,
Yeah, yeah.
for example, in the conversation around loot boxes, there's a lot of discussion around a system that is completely fair, where it's like probabilities, just the probabilities, like pure probabilities. That doesn't generate the best experience. That
Mm.
often is what generates the worst experience.
Yeah.
Actually, the best loot box systems from a player perspective, like the more enjoyable ones, are often those that are very cooked, but are very cooked in the good direction. Like they
Yeah.
over reward and they are able to ensure that what you're giving is something that you really wanted. No, even if if we think on, we were talking about the beginning about booster packs
Hmm.
in Magic the Gathering. Booster packs in Magic the Gathering are not random. Like
No.
you're always gonna get a mythic rare, or you're going like the probabilities are cooked,
Yeah.
but that's why it creates a very good experience, because that cooked experience or that those rules that are embedded there that make that it's not a pure random, like you just get 15 cards, random cards,
And we're
is what
we're
it
in
makes.
on that. We know what that payoff is likely to be roughly, so we know what to expect, and then when that expectation is met or exceeded, we're extremely happy.
Exactly. I think also one factor that I think it's a common issue with game economists is that sometimes they look at indicators that are not representative of the player experience. And I think even in politics, we see it often, no? Where like economy indicators are really good. Oh, the economy is going so well. But if the perception of people is that the economy is not going very good, because maybe, economists are looking at like the stock market, and they're looking at gross domestic product, and they're looking at indicators that are very macro, but that then in the lives of people, the stock market don't actually translate into anything. And maybe
Yeah.
inflation and living costs create a player experience, no, or a individual experience that is counterintuitive with the macroeconomic things, no?
Yeah.
In the loot boxes, I've seen it a lot, no? Where like, well, the payout, like on average, when you open um, um, loot box, you get $10, and that costs $5. So it's very rewarding, but in reality, maybe not.
Hmm.
Depends, no? Because the actual experience of like, if it gives you something that is $10 worth of value, but you really didn't want, because it's, I don't know, a character for a
Yeah.
build that really you don't want, even if on paper it's $10, it doesn't feel like
Doesn't
ten
feel like
dollars
$10. No.
And if sometimes I get $0 value or $1 value, and other times I get 20, and then on
Right.
average is 10. Yeah, on average is 10, but for every that very good roll, I may be getting 3 or 4 that are really bad, and
Yeah.
makes me feel my perception is not as a machine. Like I if I open a very bad booster pack, I'm going to be disappointed and
Yeah.
frustrated. And even if I keep on rolling, eventually I'm going to get one that is going to be so good that on paper the value is average is this thing. The actual player experience, the human experience generated is bad, no? So I think that's
I
why I
feel
say that
this.
motivation to me
Yeah.
is that important, because the macro indicators of an economy, including a game economy, could be very misguiding.
Yeah, I feel this particularly. I've got a guilty pleasure watching videos of people opening up old booster packs when they've gone to a market store. They bought a booster pack for a ridiculous amount of money, and almost every single time they never get the big payoff ones, and it's
Yep.
kind of funny. And anyway, so we could carry on with this forever, but there's like a couple of areas I'm particularly keen to get your take on, because I know you've done some great write-ups on battle passes and pricing. Well, let's see if we get to battle passes. Let's start. I mean, let's look at pricing, because I think this is an area there are a few other people I can have this depth of conversation with about pricing structures. So what I'm thinking particularly around, we've established an economy, we've got processes, we've now got these things called currencies and resources or whatever else you want to. You talked about this stuff in terms of like the forms and styles of the kinds of currency resource elements that we have in games. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how they operate, and then how you would approach putting a real money value or an exchange process to those things?
So if I recall correctly, I think you're probably talking about like an article that I wrote where I was listing like different types of currencies,
Yes,
right?
that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah,
I think that was very interesting, because at the end of the
yeah,
day, as I said, the game economy and currencies are like a major factor, or resources. They are just a means to an end. No, what we
yes,
want is they are tools, right? Like the currencies don't matter. What matters is what we want the players to do,
yes,
or encourage the players to do with those resources. They are tools, right? And I think what is a bit magic in games is that in games we can specialize currencies a lot, no? While
yes,
in real world that's not really possible, because agents on an economy can always like trade between each other, can generate contracts between each other,
yeah,
and so on. So you cannot have a specialized currencies, right? Imagine in real life, we would want to have, I don't know, we create a country and we want this currency to be only used to buy food, and this other currency to buy only video games or entertainment. We could not do that, right? Because like black markets would appear. We would trade, like if we had surplus of food currency, we would trade it. And I would say, so the magic thing with the games is that we can create rules that apply specifically to currencies, so they behave in a specific ways. You cannot accumulate more than a certain amount of currency. You can only use for currencies for these specific uses. That sort of stuff. No, so the intention that I had with that article was to try to see how different games customize that kind of currency tool
exactly.
in order to understand the different uses, and
Yeah.
especially case uses that you
With that
can
in
do.
mind, in case people haven't read that article, do you want to kind of like describe some of the principles you cover? Because I'm thinking about, like, you talked a little bit about things like soft currency, hard currency, flavored currency. Well, that's the language I use to
Yeah,
describe what you said
flavored.
about.
I like that
Yeah,
flavored
like
currency
I
concept.
often call them resources, and I have things like blueprint. I mean, there's so many different ways of slicing the cake, but rather than me, because I'm going to have plenty of space to write all this stuff. I'd love to get your kind of like, what are the kind of core jigsaw puzzle pieces of that process that you find interesting in games?
So to me, I think that some of the interesting, like I think that there are two main axes. No, one
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
complexity,
yeah.
and the other is like versatility. No, like from a game design perspective, as I say, or like as a way to manage motivation, what would be better, no, is to have as many currencies, no, the currency to be fragmented per use as much as we can, But of course, that also generates that the game may be unmanageable with near infinite amount of currencies. And also, like if the currencies themselves, their users are too specific, it also means that they may not be very good at motivating players because the use is so circumstantial. To me, what I would say the two main or maybe three main categories are the currencies that are like wide use, right? Like soft currency, hard currency, etc., that are
Yeah.
supposed to have like wide uses. No, they're
Yep.
basically like
They're
the
versatile.
currency,
Yep.
the more probably the closest equivalent to an actual currency in the game. The second, the very like flavored currencies, I think you said, like very dedicated, like you get the resource in, it has this specific use and it drives this type of specific interaction, like maybe you only get it through this game mode, etc. I think that's great to motivate players to specific actions and illustrates very well that sort of thing. And then third might be like currencies. Probably it's in the verge of the definition of what a currency is, but that you cannot really exchange, that they become more like trackers of progression. I think that XP, for example, is a very good indicator
Yeah.
or very good example, let's say, where
I
it's,
love using XP as a kind of like anchor currency, a way of like locking in. XP is just one example, but a way of saying this can only be earned through play. Therefore, I can balance the other economic systems around that, knowing that that's tied
yeah,
to the
it's
progression of
purely
flow.
incremental, let's say.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm not sure if that answered
No, it's like, I
your
mean, like I say,
question.
well, you went into a bit more detail, so it's definitely worth people checking that article out. But I think this idea of understanding flavor and, like you said, the versatility versus the speciality, and the reason I find that particularly exciting is because of the way that we can use that to motivate player choices, especially when it's in the context of the thing that I've just talked this through with somebody on a different podcast around the use of hot dog economics. 8 hot dogs, 6 buns. Therefore, I might as well get more buns because I've got leftover hot dogs. Now I've got too many buns, so I might as well get some more hot dogs. This kind of imbalance, I think, becomes really interesting as motivational kind of rationale about which activities I choose next in order to get the benefits of those resources. And not the resources are making me do it, but the resources are the kind of side benefit of all the choice of what I could do. That's the one that's going to solve my current need. Or I only just need 2 more of that.
Yeah, as I said, at the end of the day, what we want is to encourage the players to take certain actions, no? And the currencies, the amount and the characteristics of the currency are means to that end, no? And in some situations, depending on the audience and the experience that you want to generate, it will be a better approach to take certain specific approaches regarding currencies, like maybe many currencies and so on. Maybe in other cases, it's better to have fewer currencies and a simple.
And that is the challenge, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, there are some amazing sophisticated tools we can produce by looking at the frequency or the effort required for soft currencies of 1, 2, or 3 different types of hard currencies, which maybe get some free access through play, but mostly are paid for, versus real money. And all these things have different qualities and benefits for the player experience. But at the end of the day, if we overcomplicate things, then you've just created more of a mess for players to understand the motivation in the first place. And you're more distant you are from the things that players care about. Because again, this is the bit I was kind of not, I'm leading to, which is currencies themselves aren't motivators. Currencies
Yep.
are the liquidity of getting to those motivators, if that makes
Correct.
sense.
Yeah, and I think the key challenge there is that there's a lot of, it's very probably because you don't have a single audience in a game, you often have multiple audiences. It's very difficult to have a system that really satisfies everyone, no? And I think that this, very interestingly, to me, an example of this that I saw recently was when with the new Pokemon trading card game on mobile, and the way the economy and resource system has been designed in this game is very, very Japanese, right? Like there's a lot of resources, with some resources that are extremely circumstantial. And for many Japanese players that's just okay. It even has a component of fun. This
Yes.
because it's kind of almost as, or it encourages like collection mechanisms, like, oh, I do this because it gives me this mini resource that is used only on this specific situation to grade cards to this thing, and it kind of generates almost like a collection, no? But you're more than Pokemon. What you're capturing is like the specific currencies. But then
Yeah.
when that same system is exposed to more like Western audiences that maybe value more the gameplay itself and just like playing the game, the actual card game, let's say, they get very confused and like shocked. They don't understand it. They play, but it's like, why does it have this many complexity? And it was quite interesting. I was seeing like different social networks and people were talking like, oh, this is because they want to alter our perception. And like trying to look for a lot of subtext that in my experience as a game economy designer is not there. It's not
No.
like there's no
We're trying to
like
keep
weird
a hand on all
shenanigans.
this. Yeah.
It's just that that's commonplace in Japanese games. They often have a lot of resources. Players that are more used to complex economies with very circumstantial resources. They even enjoy this kind of like trying to find, oh, but this thing, where do I get this yellow diamond currency that allows me for this specific upgrade? It's part of the dynamics that are popular there, encourage discussions online and so on, and are popular there, but they are not popular maybe in the West.
Yeah.
And the problem is that if you try to have a system that satisfies different audiences that are looking for different things and that are used to play in different ways, it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, totally agree.
And this, I think it was a very interesting case because there was an element of two different geographies with different ways how we interact with games, but it can also happen in games that have like more, that maybe in some RPGs there are more players that are more value skill and they're more competitive, but maybe you have other players that value more like collection, and creating an economy that satisfies everyone is always challenging because not all of them want the same thing.
No, and I think you're right in terms of like geographic, but also in game genre. I mean, I think, one of the things about certain types of game formats, the complexity of the character kind of interactions can be part of the point. And they tend to be games which are more specialist, have smaller audiences, but they have often very dedicated audiences. Whereas, games that have broader audiences will tend to need that simplicity. And I think both are different challenges. Both are interesting. It depends on what you're trying to make as a game maker, but also who your audience is.
Yeah, I think that there is an interesting concept. Not entirely sure if it's related to game economy, but it's part of the things that need to be taken, which are, I think, the game tropes. Like if as a player, I don't come from the void to take the game, no? Often I would have played other games and
Absolutely.
there are some conceptions on how things should work in the game. I don't know. I expect that the currency doesn't evaporate every 24 hours. But you can, as a game designer, you can design currency like, well, if you don't spend it every 24 hours, it's burned and it disappears. But there are some players' expectations, and if you twist them, well, you can end up with situations that maybe you make sense from a developer perspective, but do not make sense in the head of the players.
But also context matters. So what you described there, an evaporating currency, could have a legitimate, really interesting game purpose. It's just the fact that we as economy designers are calling it a currency, whereas somebody else might call it, I don't know, water.
Exactly.
Or whatever else. And it's the thing, as long as it's established why that works in the context of the game, and it makes sense and doesn't feel overly arduous to the player, it might be a perfectly legitimate mechanic.
Yep.
But the
way it's contextualized and presented to players
precisely
will alter the perception. No? I think that gold storage is a great in Clash of Clans. It's a great example. No, like they innovated. One of the many innovations that the game has is that the size of the storage represents how much gold you can hold, and that has its own dynamics when it comes to raiding and why you raid and why you're raided.
I love capacity as a mechanism. I think
But
it's
the way
so
it's
clever.
presented, it's fantastic. No, if it was maybe more arbitrary, not contextualized with the same amount of care, probably players would not get it, or maybe would have a visceral reaction against
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, and again, like you say, it's the care in which it's presented. So we haven't got a huge amount of time left. I have so many topics that I love talking to you about, but I'm going to go into. I'm going to ask you about battle passes. Now, I'm of the belief that a battle pass, mechanically, whatever you call it, is one of the best experiences that we can make for a player. Where it's about the more you play, the more you get, and if you pay, you can get everything. If you're a free player, you can still get anything. That's kind of like a base principle I look at. I know you've did an article about I don't know, a couple of years ago on Battle Pass design, but in that time, I would argue Battle Passes have got a bit of a dirty kind of label by some players, particularly kind of Steam PC players. Where are you? Where are you on Battle Passes, and what do you think are the best practices for using those kind of techniques?
Yeah, battle passes are very interesting
Mm,
because even more perhaps than loot boxes, they would be type of system that to me as a developer they are extremely positive because as you
yeah.
said, no, it's well I spend time in the game and that time gets transformed into like rewards. What's better than that, right? As opposed to maybe loot boxes where I spend time and energy and resources and maybe I don't get what I wanted. To me, like the battle passes as a developer, I would think they are fantastic. But then one of the interesting insights after writing on battle passes and seeing the broader audience, sometimes not game developers but like players, interact and comment with that article was that actually the perception from players was quite negative about
Mm,
not the article. The article they took it, they enjoyed it, but about the battle pass, they felt it was they had a negative perception about
uh,
the system itself, like the existence of the battle pass, which was quite interesting. And I think that there again, it's a situation where there is a mismatch between the experience that we want in many games. There's a mismatch between the experience that we want players to feel and the experience that they actually generate, right? And
yeah.
interestingly, a lot of players were that reacted to comment because I post the articles in Reddit and I get interaction from all sort of like different players. And they were saying like, well, this is a time sink. Maybe I don't have that much time, or they are making me play in ways that I really did not want to play, like maybe
Mm,
quests that I didn't want to do that feel that I'm playing with characters that I really didn't want to play with, and so on, in order to complete missions so I can get XP to get the rewards. No, they many felt it was very grindy and so on. So for me, what ultimately, the insight that I or the lesson that I got was that the important thing is to understand what was the player experience that we wanted to get, and then every little mechanic that is described in that article, like how to manage length, how to manage pricing, etc., are more like factors that we need to align towards that experience that we want to that and yeah, so yeah, that to me was the best
Yeah,
or the
no,
biggest insight.
totally. And I think for me, what you're describing is again, we're coming back to the same. So this repeating process, which is where we see people say take a loot crate or use currency or use battle passes, but they don't think about the context of why those systems function in the originating games, and therefore how does that apply to this game to create in-depth engagement for the player. That's where we have that break. And that's where we have that kind of not breach of trust, that's too strong, but this breach kind of like expectation. So if we create a battle pass which becomes very, very grindy, that forces a particular style of play which doesn't necessarily resonate with the player, we've obviously made a mismatch with the expectation and reality. And I think that to me is a fundamental driver. So understanding what your battle pass is supposed to be doing and how it's framed, it's almost like we're saying here is context, context, context.
Yeah, and like specifically on the topic of grindiness, let's
Mm,
say, what I think it's key when we're like designing a battle bus or any kind of system is why does it feel grindy? Because I think that we can rationalize explanations and solutions that do not really solve the problem, right? Like, well, it feels grindy because it requires 3 matches between reward and reward. Let's make it down to 1 match. Well, but if the reward that you're getting after every match is completely pointless because it may be a fraction of something that is really a reward, yeah, you're giving away things on every match, but it's still going to be feeling very grindy. Or maybe it feels grindy because the way to progress is to achieve missions, and the missions make players play in ways that they feel that they don't enjoy. For example,
Yeah.
no? I think that designing battle pass or any kind of system, at the end of the day, it's a myriad of micro decisions. And what is again important is to understand well what is the experience that we want to generate as a guiding element for that micro decisions. And for some audiences and some games, some micro decisions are better than others. I would not say there is like the right way to do the battle pass. It's more
No.
like, well, there are several decisions that you can take. Of course, there are general concepts that may be applicable to a wide range of games and so on. Like if you put 2 rewards extremely separated between time, of course, that's not going to feel engaging and so on. But the contrary may not necessarily be true. So obviously there are like general concepts, but at the end of the day, it's more task of understanding well what is the audience that you are working with, what's the kind of experience that you want to provide to that audience, and then on every single micro decision take the right approach to align that to what you want to do. And also I think that a lot of playtesting and tweaking things, no, in order to maybe you can have stuff that in your head it works one way, but then you expose it to reality and it's completely different.
No,
The
exactly.
experience that it generates, and you need to tune it.
Now, normally I'd be saying to people, what's the one thing you'd leave to. I feel like you've just told everybody the thing to do, but I mean, let's try it. So is there one thing you'd like people to take away from this conversation? What's the sort of most important thing a game economy designer should be thinking about, given the things we've talked about so far?
For me, there will be two things, maybe 3 things.
I'll give you 3.
Let's see if I remember the 3 of them. But one is intentionality in the design.
Yeah.
The design of the economy is a means to an end. So you need to understand well, or at least as a designer, you need to know what you want to obtain from that economy. What do you want the players to do? What actions do you want them to encourage? And then my advice would be to build backwards from there. No, if you want players to play all the game modes, then start with that. No, I want players to play all the game modes. Okay, so how can I build an economy that encourages, that it makes that the smartest way to play the game is to play all of the game modes? And then that intentionality is the pillar of why and how you build the economy. The second point that to me is very important is do not assume that because something makes sense on paper, it makes sense in reality. And we
absolutely
mentioned several times where you do the mathematical proof, this, yes, it's fair, it's $10 on average every loot box, or it's 10 units of value for every minute that you spend in the game through the battle pass. But then the perception of the player, of the actual, like the real human on the other end, may be completely different. Again, don't assume that because the formula makes sense, that creates an experience that is enjoyable. I think that requires a lot of personal play testing, like expose yourself to play the economy that you have designed and see if that correlates with the intention that you want, as well as talking directly with players, because maybe their perception is very different. Because specifically in free to play, there are players that are extremely engaged, like not the average person, and maybe there's one element in the experience that completely changes their perception versus the average person that maybe you as a developer have it easier to predict. And then the third element I did forget.
That's all good. I mean, this is.
I remember the third thing is that, like, try to approach the design from different perspectives. Specifically, I think one of the topics that we didn't mention but are extremely correlated with game economy is monetization, right? Like as we said, like game economy has systems to create motivations, and one of the things we want the players to motivate with, often in games that have microtransactions and so on, is to keep them motivating to spend. No, that can take a lot of wrong turns. that can make situations where the game is not enjoyable, or the economy makes that the game is not enjoyable unless you spend money. I think that the worst way to approach this is to think games about as if they were zero-sum systems, where anything that the game gives you is potential value that you could be spending and you are not going to. That's the worst approach. I think that the best, if you want games to really work and to be sustainable over time and to grow, you need to think them as a positive sum systems where you give stuff and you get stuff in return. If the game is not enjoyable and if spending is not enjoyable, yeah, you maybe can make a certain amount of money, but you are going to eventually burn your players,
Absolutely.
and very quickly that's not going to be the best approach to deal with a game economy.
And I think if we look at it, the games that have been the most successful in the world are those that have an audience, a community of people who absolutely love the game. And I think, you only have to go back to that to realize that, if we play tricks on players, if we give them experiences which make them feel exploited, they're not going to end up loving our game experience. And as you said, 90% of the time we see those things being claimed, it's because someone in the game development team have stuffed up. They've made a mistake. And most of the game economy designers out there aren't sitting there twirling their moustache in their top hats, wanting to exploit people. We actually just want to make great games.
Yeah, absolutely. What is I find quite interesting is the fact that in game economy, sadly, often what we see is game economies that are like too greedy, that they are super scarce, make the game not enjoyable and so on. But you can also have the other way around. You can have a game economies that are overly rewarding, and that also damages the fun. I think a great
Very
example of this is Legends of Runeterra, the trading card game of Riot Games. And there, the game was extremely reward. Like I think they took the same approach that they take with like their MOBA game. Like, okay, you don't pay for cards. We're going to give you all the cards for free, more resources than you need, and focus more in cosmetics. And what was very interesting is that although in MOBA that works perfectly, I think a trading card game, it damaged the element of collection because you had all the cards, you had the deck that you wanted, and that took away a lot of the wonder and a lot of the fun that you get from a card game, which is the collection element. When I have more resources than I need and I can just easily craft any card that exists, that takes away part of the fun.
Absolutely.
So I think that goes in. Well, I don't think the game economy is an exact science, because at the end of the day, what we want is to create a mental effect, which is keep players engaged. And that is, there's no exact number. There's a range, right?
Exactly. It's a system.
Numbers.
It's a system that evolves and adapts to the other systems currently ongoing. So I think that's great. Javier, that's been fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time out. So if people wanted to find out more about what you're doing, what's the best way for them to find out more about you?
They can reach out to me in LinkedIn. I think that's, if
almost
you want to
everyone's
talk
saying
to me
LinkedIn
and maybe
nowadays.
tell me, hey, this thing
Yeah.
that you said was not. I disagree. I'm fine. I mean, we can discuss. And I also recommend people to check out the Constructor Fund. That's it's a media thing. They have podcast, a blog, and so on. And I've been collaborating for the past few years.
Yeah. And there's some
Quite
great
a bit.
articles and blog posts you've written for those guys as well out there. Well worth checking out.
Yeah, I think what is nice is that it's a way to like get in the heads of professionals that are really industry veterans, much better than me. I'm just like a small fry there. So I would encourage, if anyone wants to learn more about game economy on top of playing games and try to dissect the economies, I think that the best way to learn something is to try to deconstruct it, right? But
Absolutely.
also to go to those articles, because there you could see experts tearing down those sort of systems and those sort of game economies from other games. and explain each of.
Fantastic stuff. Javier, thank you so much. And if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share, all the usual stuff. And obviously, please go check out Deconstructor Fun. There's amazing stuff out there as well. I think I saw a post a little while ago talking about they've got over 2 million listens on that podcast already. So, it's a big deal. Like I say, check out the articles as well. There's some really interesting stuff and that's worth checking out there as well. But thank you very much for taking part. And obviously, we'll be carrying on our conversation and I'll dive into everything to do with the game economy. Thank you very much. And to all, goodbye.